A transatlantic flight, a seat in business class, paid for and confirmed for Dr. Gabrielle Morgan. It was supposed to be a routine trip to a vital international conference, but when a flight attendant with a chip on her shoulder decided her seat would be better occupied by someone else, the routine flight turned into a public battle of wills. The flight attendant, Rebecca, used every tactic she could think of. Sweet-talking, guilt-tripping, and finally open threats to force this unassuming black woman to move. She thought she held all the power at 35,000 feet. She was wrong because when Dr. Morgan finally reached into her briefcase, she wasn't pulling out a boarding pass. She was pulling out a level of authority that would not only end the argument but would ground the flight attendant's career for good. "Ma'am, I'll need to see your boarding pass again. This doesn't look right." The words came from a gate agent at Washington Dulles International Airport, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied the business class ticket in her hand. Dr. Gabrielle Morgan maintained her composed expression, having encountered this particular brand of scrutiny countless times before. "The ticket is correct," Gabrielle replied calmly. "Seat 5D, Atlantic Global Flight 847 to Zurich." The agent glanced from the ticket to Gabrielle's face, then back again, before reluctantly nodding and returning the boarding pass. "Enjoy your flight, ma'am." Gabrielle accepted her boarding pass with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. At 45, she had mastered the art of navigating these small indignities with grace. As the director of airworthiness standards at the Federal Aviation Administration, she was accustomed to being the only black woman in rooms full of white men, her authority frequently questioned despite her credentials. The terminal buzzed with pre-flight energy. Business travelers tapping urgently on laptops, families corralling excited children, airport staff directing the controlled chaos with practiced efficiency. Gabrielle moved through it all with deliberate calm, her navy pantsuit impeccably tailored, her carry-on roller bag gliding silently beside her. She had selected her seat months ago with careful consideration. Seat 5D, a window seat in business class positioned forward of the wing for minimal noise with easy access to the lavatory, but not so close as to be disturbed by foot traffic. It was the kind of detailed planning that characterized both her professional and personal life. As she waited in the priority boarding line, Gabrielle absently touched the face of her watch, a vintage Breitling Aerospace her father had worn throughout his 30-year career as a Boeing engineer. The scratched face and worn leather strap told the story of a lifetime dedicated to aviation safety. When he'd passed 5 years ago, it had become her most treasured possession, a tangible connection to the man who had first taught her to look up at the sky with wonder and scientific curiosity. Her thoughts drifted to the International Aviation Safety Symposium awaiting her in Zurich. Her keynote speech on next-generation composite materials would be the culmination of years of research, work that would shape aircraft design and safety protocols for decades to come. The presentation was saved on both her tablet and laptop with a third backup on a USB drive. Preparation was not just a habit for Gabrielle, it was a philosophy. The boarding announcement crackled over the loudspeaker, and Gabrielle joined the orderly procession of business-class passengers. As she approached the aircraft, an Airbus A350-1000, her engineer's mind automatically cataloged its features: the distinctive swept winglets, the quiet and efficient Rolls-Royce Trent XWB engines, the carbon fiber reinforced polymer fuselage. This wasn't just transportation to her. It was a marvel of human innovation, a complex system where every component had been tested, verified, and certified, many under her own oversight. Welcome aboard. The flight attendant at the door greeted her with the practiced smile of someone 8 hours into a 12-hour shift. Gabrielle nodded in acknowledgement and entered the cabin, already mentally shifting gears from airport navigation to her pre-flight routine. She had a specific sequence for settling in: stowing her carry-on, organizing her personal items, preparing her workspace. It was this attention to detail, this methodical approach to even the smallest tasks, that had propelled her from a scholarship student at MIT to one of the FAA's most respected directors. "Good afternoon," she said, as she approached her row, nodding to the passenger already seated in the aisle seat. The journey to Zurich was just beginning, but Gabrielle Morgan was, as always, thoroughly prepared for whatever might lie ahead. The business-class cabin of the Airbus A350-1000 welcomed Gabrielle with its muted luxury. Soft, ambient lighting illuminated the spacious pod-style seats, each designed to transform into a fully flat bed for the overnight transatlantic crossing. The air carried that distinctive mixture of scents unique to premium aircraft cabins, the faint smell of jet fuel that always lingered at the boarding door quickly giving way to the clean fragrance of the cabin's air freshener, the leather of the seats, and the subtle aroma of the pre-departure beverage service beginning at the front of the cabin. Gabrielle located 5D and efficiently stowed her carry-on in the overhead compartment, keeping only her slim leather briefcase with her essential items. With practiced movements, she settled into her seat, immediately locating and testing the various controls that would adjust the seat's position throughout the flight. The window beside her offered a view of ground crew finishing their preparations, moving with purpose across the tarmac. From her handbag, she withdrew a small travel kit containing noise-canceling earbuds, an eye mask, and travel-sized skincare products for the dry cabin air. Each item had its place in the storage compartments built into her seat console. Next came her professional materials: a slim tablet for reading her notes for the symposium, and a small notebook with a fountain pen clipped to its cover. She arranged these within easy reach, creating an efficient workspace for the 8-hour flight. A flight attendant approached with a tray of welcome beverages. Sparkling water, please, Gabrielle requested, accepting the crystal glass with a slice of lime. As she sipped her water, Gabrielle's mind drifted back to the day she'd received her promotion to Director of Airworthiness Standards. It had been 3 years ago, but the memory remained vivid. Director Blackwood had called her into his office, unusually serious even for him. The board's decision was unanimous. "Gabrielle," he had said, sliding the official letter across his desk, "your work on the composite materials certification framework alone would have secured it, but combined with your leadership during the 737 recertification process..." He had paused, allowing himself a rare smile. "Well, let's just say it wasn't a difficult decision." She had accepted the position with the same quiet confidence with which she approached all professional challenges, even as she recognized its significance. In the FAA's 100-year history, she was only the second black woman to achieve a directorship in the Aviation Safety Division. Gabrielle was drawn back to the present as more passengers filed past her seat. She observed them with the subtle attention to detail that had become second nature in her career, noting their behaviors, their interactions with the crew, the way they handled their belongings. Safety assessment never truly stopped for her, even in casual settings. The distinctive click of the cabin door closing signaled that boarding was complete. Gabrielle felt the subtle shift in the aircraft as the jetway disconnected, followed by the gentle push as the tug began moving them back from the gate. This was the moment she loved, the transition from ground to air, from the mundane to the miraculous. No matter how many flights she took, she never lost her appreciation for the physics and engineering that made flight possible. She powered down her devices in preparation for takeoff, tucking her tablet into the seat pocket. Her fingers brushed the cool metal of her father's watch, and she found herself adjusting it slightly on her wrist. He had been the one who first explained lift and drag to her when she was just 7 years old, using paper airplanes in their backyard in Atlanta. "Remember, Gabby," he would say, "every force has a counterforce. The trick is making them work together instead of against each other." That lesson had served her well beyond aerodynamics. Gabrielle closed her eyes briefly, centering herself with a deep breath. The symposium, the presentation, the meetings with international counterparts, all would require her full focus and energy. This flight would be her time to prepare mentally, to review her notes one final time, and perhaps even to get some much-needed rest. As the safety demonstration began, Gabrielle followed along out of professional courtesy, though she could have recited every word from memory. The A350's engines began their distinctive spool-up, a sound she could identify blindfolded. The vibrations traveled through the airframe and into her seat, a mechanical pulse that signaled imminent departure. For these precious hours above the Atlantic, she would exist in a state of peaceful transition, between continents, between responsibilities. It was a rare moment of in-between that she had learned to cherish. Or at least that had been her plan. Rebecca Palmer moved through the business class cabin with practiced efficiency, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun that accentuated her sharp features. At 52, she carried herself with the rigid posture of someone who had spent decades enforcing the small rules of the sky. Her Atlantic Global uniform, navy blazer with gold accents, matching pencil skirt, and a crimson scarf at her throat, was impeccable, worn like armor rather than attire. "We've got a seat issue in row 9, she informed her colleague Sofia Rodriguez, not bothering to lower her voice as she glanced at her manifest. "The system glitch is causing havoc again." Sophia, 27 and still relatively new to international routes, nodded attentively. "Do you want me to handle it?" She offered, her warm demeanor a stark contrast to Rebecca's chilly efficiency. "No," Rebecca replied curtly. "I'll take care of it. You finish the welcome drinks." The unspoken hierarchy was clear. Rebecca had 25 years of seniority, and she never let anyone forget it. What Rebecca never mentioned to her colleagues was how different her career path was supposed to have been. The framed commercial pilot's license gathering dust in her apartment was a testament to dreams deferred. Dreams that had crashed against the reality of 1990s aviation when female pilots were still rarities, and the expense of flight hours had proven insurmountable on her teacher father's salary. The flight attendant position had been meant to be temporary, a way to stay close to aviation while saving for additional flight training. 25 years later, she was still walking the aisles instead of sitting in the cockpit. Rebecca's attention shifted to row 9, where Thomas and Amanda Whitmore were engaged in an increasingly heated discussion with another passenger. Thomas Whitmore, 58 tall with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to obedience, was the chief financial officer of Pinnacle Commercial Properties, a fact he had already mentioned twice during boarding. His wife Amanda, a petite woman of 56 with expensively maintained blonde hair and a tennis-toned physique, stood beside him clutching a designer handbag that cost more than Rebecca's monthly salary. "I specifically booked our seats together," Thomas was saying, his voice carrying that particular tone of wealthy indignation. "This is completely unacceptable." Rebecca approached with her most practiced customer service smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, how can I assist you today?" Amanda turned immediately. "Thank goodness. We have a situation here. Thomas and I always sit together, but they've assigned me to 12B halfway across the cabin." Rebecca nodded sympathetically while quickly assessing the situation. The payment system glitch had been wreaking havoc with seat assignments for weeks, scrambling even confirmed bookings during the final database sync. It was a technical problem that had become a customer service nightmare. "Let me see what I can do," she said, taking their boarding passes. "We've been experiencing some technical issues with our reservation system." Thomas huffed impatiently. "Well, fix it. We're Premier Platinum members and spend over $50,000 annually with Atlantic Global." Rebecca's eyes scanned the cabin, mentally reviewing the seat map. Most of the business class cabin was full with elite status passengers, executives, consultants, and frequent flyers who would be equally resistant to moving. Her gaze settled on seat 5D, where a black woman sat alone by the window, focused on organizing some papers. Rebecca narrowed her eyes slightly, making a rapid series of calculations and assumptions. The woman wasn't dressed in the designer clothes typical of business-class travelers, wearing a pantsuit that, while professional, lacked the obvious luxury markers of the Whitmores. She wasn't chatting with other passengers or ordering champagne. She didn't fit Rebecca's mental image of the typical business-class traveler. "I believe I can solve this problem for you," she told the Whitmores with renewed confidence. "If you'll return to your assigned seat." Mr. Whitmore, I'll arrange for someone to move so Mrs. Whitmore can join you." As Thomas reluctantly returned to 9C, Rebecca made her way forward, Sophia watching curiously from the galley. Rebecca had developed a sixth sense over the years for which passengers would yield to her authority and which would resist. The woman in 5D struck her as someone who wouldn't cause problems, probably a last-minute upgrade or an employee traveling on a discounted ticket. Rebecca didn't notice the custom leather briefcase with government markings partially visible under the seat. She didn't register the precise way the woman had arranged her workspace, nor the Aerospace Engineering Journal among her reading materials. She saw only what she expected to see someone who didn't belong in the premium cabin, according to her biased mental rubric. "This should be simple," Rebecca murmured to herself, approaching row 5 with confident steps. Meanwhile, Thomas Whitmore settled into 9C, checking his Rolex and frowning. As a man who managed billions in commercial real estate assets, he was unaccustomed to waiting for anything. Amanda remained standing near the galley, scrolling through her phone where her lifestyle Instagram account, @AmandaWhitmoreLiving, showcased her curated existence of luxury travel exclusive fitness regimens and inspirational quotes about positivity and manifestation. Her latest post, a carefully staged photo of her boarding pass and a champagne flute, had already garnered hundreds of likes from followers aspiring to her level of privilege. "I don't see why someone can't just move," she muttered to Sophia, who was attempting to serve welcome drinks around her. "It's not like we're asking for something unreasonable." Sophia maintained her professional smile while silently disagreeing. In her 3 years with Atlantic Global, she had observed the same patterns repeatedly. The assumption that rules were flexible for some passengers and rigid for others, often along lines of privilege that rarely needed explicit acknowledgement. As Rebecca Palmer approached Dr. Gabrielle Morgan's seat, the invisible social machinery that had functioned smoothly for the Whitmores throughout their lives was about to encounter an unexpected disruption, one that would reveal how quickly assumed authority crumbles when confronted with the genuine article. "Excuse me, ma'am." Rebecca began, her voice carrying a sweetness that didn't reach her eyes. She leaned slightly into Gabrielle's personal space, one hand resting on the headrest of the seat in front. "I have a small favor to ask of you." Gabrielle looked up from her notes, her expression neutral but attentive. She had been in the middle of reviewing a technical passage about composite material stress tolerances when the shadow of the flight attendant fell across her papers. "How can I help you?" she asked, her tone professional and measured. Rebecca's practiced smile widened slightly. "We have a situation with a lovely couple Premier Platinum members who were unfortunately separated due to a booking error. Mr. Whitmore is in 9C and his wife is all the way back in 12B. She gestured vaguely toward the rear of the cabin. "I was hoping you might be willing to take Mrs. Whitmore's seat so they could sit together. It would be such a help to us." The request hung in the air. Gabrielle noticed immediately how Rebecca had addressed her as ma'am, while referring to Amanda Whitmore as Mrs. Whitmore, a subtle but telling distinction in formality. She also caught the emphasis on the couple's elite status, as if that should automatically persuade her. Several rows back, Amanda Whitmore stood watching, arms crossed, a look of expectant entitlement on her face. Behind her, Sophia pretended to be busy with the beverage cart while keeping an eye on the interaction. "I understand the situation," Gabrielle replied calmly, "but I specifically selected this seat months ago for this flight. It's a window seat away from the galley, which I need for work and rest during this overnight flight. I'm afraid I'll need to decline." Rebecca's smile faltered for a split second before regaining its fixed position. "Oh, but seat 12B is quite comfortable as well, Mrs. Whitmore is on her way to a second honeymoon in Switzerland, and it would mean so much to them to start their trip together." She lowered her voice to a confidential tone. "Between us, Mr. Whitmore is quite upset about the situation." A middle-aged businessman across the aisle glanced up from his newspaper, then quickly looked away when he caught Gabrielle's eye. A couple seated in row 6 whispered to each other, watching the exchange with uncomfortable curiosity. "I sympathize with their disappointment," Gabrielle said, her voice still even, but that doesn't change my position. I selected and paid for this specific seat for professional reasons. I have a keynote address to finalize during this flight. The answer is no, thank you. Rebecca straightened her demeanor, shifting subtly from faux friendly to authoritative. Ma'am, we at Atlantic Global always try to accommodate our elite passengers. It's just a seat. Surely you can understand. It's not just a seat, Gabrielle interrupted firmly, but without raising her voice. It's the seat I booked, confirmed, and paid for. I understand you're trying to solve a problem, but not at my expense. Thomas Whitmore had been watching from row 9. Now he rose from his seat and approached his imposing height and confident stride, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. Is there a problem here? He asked, addressing Rebecca rather than Gabrielle. His voice carried that particular timbre of a man used to being the most important person in the room. Mr. Whitmore, please return to your seat, Rebecca said, though her tone lacked conviction. I'm handling the situation. Doesn't look like you're handling anything, he replied, turning his attention to Gabrielle. Look, my wife and I always sit together. Always. I don't think it's too much to ask for someone to be accommodating about a simple seat change. Gabrielle felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same sensation she'd experienced countless times throughout her career when her boundaries were treated as suggestions rather than firm limits. It reminded her of being 16, dressed in her Sunday best, waiting in the lobby of the Marquis Hotel in Atlanta for her parents. The manager had approached her then, too. This area is for guests only, he'd said, not even considering that she belonged there. She hadn't had the authority to challenge him then. She'd been escorted outside to wait on the curb, the humiliation burning in her cheeks as hotel guests watched. That moment had shaped her, hardened something inside her that had never fully softened. Mr. Whitmore, she said, looking him directly in the eye, I understand you're disappointed. However, this is my assigned seat and I've declined the request to move. That should be the end of the discussion. Amanda Whitmore had now joined her husband standing in the aisle with her designer bag clutched to her chest like a shield. This is ridiculous, she said loudly enough for the entire cabin to hear. We're Premier Platinum. We spend thousands with this airline. Sophia moved forward cautiously, sensing the escalating tension. Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, perhaps we could look for another solution. Maybe another passenger would be willing to swap. Rebecca shot Sophia a warning glance before turning back to Gabrielle. Ma'am, we're simply trying to create a pleasant atmosphere for all our passengers. Your cooperation would be greatly appreciated. The cabin had grown noticeably quieter as more passengers tuned into the unfolding drama. Someone in row 8 had discreetly pointed their phone toward the scene recording the interaction. Gabrielle remained seated, her posture straight, her expression composed. I've given you my answer. I'm not moving from my assigned seat. I suggest you find another solution that doesn't involve displacing me from the seat I specifically selected and paid for. Thomas Whitmore made a sound of disgust. Unbelievable, he muttered loud enough to be heard. Some people are just so selfish. The word hung in the air, selfish. A barbed accusation intended to shame her into compliance. It was a tactic Gabrielle had encountered before, the implication that asserting her own rights somehow made her unreasonable or difficult. Rebecca's face had hardened now, her customer service mask slipping to reveal the frustration beneath. She was unused to having her authority questioned, especially in front of premium passengers like the Whitmores. This was supposed to have been a simple solution to a common problem. Find the passenger with the least power and pressure them to move. She hadn't expected resistance, and she certainly hadn't expected the calm, immovable force that was Dr. Gabrielle Morgan, a woman who had spent her entire career standing firm in rooms where others expected her to bend. Ma'am, Rebecca said, dropping all pretense of warmth from her voice. Perhaps I haven't made myself clear. This is a very full flight, and we need to resolve seating issues before departure. She leaned closer, lowering her voice to a near whisper that nonetheless carried an unmistakable edge. The Whitmores are very valued customers with our airline. I really need you to cooperate here." Gabrielle recognized the shift in tactics immediately. The request had become a demand, the friendly facade giving way to thinly veiled intimidation. She had faced this exact pivot countless times in her career, the moment when a smile transformed into a threat because her boundaries had remained intact against expectations. "I understand perfectly," Gabrielle replied, her voice steady but firm. "And I've given you my answer. I will not be moving from my assigned seat." Rebecca's lips pressed into a thin line as she straightened. "Very well." She turned to the Whitmores with an apologetic smile. "Let me see what other options we might have." But Thomas Whitmore had no intention of retreating quietly. "No, this is absurd," he said, his voice rising. "Why is this so difficult? It's a simple seat change." Several passengers were now openly watching the confrontation. A woman in row 7 caught Gabrielle's eye and gave a small nod of support. Across the aisle, the businessman who had been pretending to read his newspaper had abandoned all pretense and was watching with undisguised interest. In the galley, Sophia spoke quietly into the cabin interphone, her concerned expression suggesting she was updating the flight deck about the situation. As she did, another subtle drama was unfolding outside the aircraft. Through her window, Gabrielle noticed a maintenance crew examining something near the right engine, their movements methodical and unhurried. A minor technical concern being addressed with professional calm, a stark contrast to the manufactured crisis unfolding inside the cabin. "Mr. Whitmore," Rebecca said, trying to regain control of the situation, "please return to your seat for now. I'm sure we can find another solution." "I'm not moving until this is resolved," he insisted, gesturing toward Gabrielle. "I don't understand why some people feel entitled to inconvenience others." The irony of his statement was not lost on Gabrielle, nor on several of the observing passengers. Amanda Whitmore had positioned herself strategically in the aisle, ensuring she was blocking the path of the boarding stragglers still making their way to the back of the plane, creating a physical manifestation of the entitlement her husband was verbally expressing. Gabrielle weighed her options carefully. She could simply give in, move to 12B, surrender her carefully selected seat, and avoid further conflict. It would certainly be easier. The presentation would still get finalized. The symposium would go on. She'd arrive in Zurich perhaps a bit more tired, a bit more frustrated, but largely unaffected in practical terms. But something deeper held her in place. The accumulated weight of 1,000 similar moments when she had been expected to accommodate to make herself smaller to yield space she had rightfully claimed. She thought about the young women she mentored, especially the women of color entering aviation and aerospace fields. What would she tell them to do in this situation? Yield to pressure. Accept the unacceptable. The answer was clear. Rebecca, sensing Gabrielle's continued resistance, decided to escalate further. "Ma'am," she said loudly enough for the surrounding rows to hear, "your refusal to cooperate is creating a disturbance. We need all passengers to comply with crew member instructions." This strategic reframing, transforming a passenger defending her assigned seat into someone creating a disturbance, was calculated to shift cabin sentiment against Gabrielle. It was a tactic Gabrielle had seen before, the subtle deployment of language to recast assertion as aggression, particularly when coming from a black woman. "I am not creating a disturbance," Gabrielle responded, her voice clear and measured. "I am sitting quietly in my assigned seat. The disturbance is coming from those demanding I give it up." A murmur of agreement came from somewhere behind them. Rebecca turned sharply, unable to identify which passenger had voiced support for Gabrielle. At that moment, the cabin door closed with a distinctive thunk, and the captain's voice came over the PA system. "Cabin crew, prepare for departure." This standard announcement seemed to galvanize Rebecca, who now faced the time pressure of completing the pre-departure checklist. Her face flushed with a mixture of frustration and embarrassment as she realized the situation was slipping from her control. "This isn't over," she said to Gabrielle, her professional mask slipping further. "We'll address this once we're airborne." As Rebecca moved away to attend to her required duties, Thomas Whitmore remained standing, looming over Gabrielle's seat. "You know," he said, lowering his voice to what he likely thought was a conspiratorial tone, "some people should just be grateful they're up here in business class at all." The implication was unmistakable, and it landed exactly as intended. A reminder that in his worldview, Gabrielle was an interloper in a space where she didn't belong. Gabrielle met his gaze directly. "Mr. Whitmore, I belong in this seat because I booked it and paid for it just like everyone else here. Your insinuation is both incorrect and inappropriate." Her calm response seemed to fluster him momentarily. He wasn't accustomed to direct confrontation, particularly from those he considered beneath his social station. Whatever he muttered before finally returning to his seat, where he immediately began complaining loudly to the passenger beside him. Sophia appeared at Gabrielle's side, discreetly placing a fresh glass of sparkling water on her console. "I apologize for the disturbance," she said quietly. "Can I get you anything else before takeoff?" The small gesture of professional courtesy, treating Gabrielle as a valued passenger rather than a problem to be solved, did not go unnoticed. "Thank you." "No," Gabrielle replied with a brief, genuine smile. "This is perfect." As the aircraft began pushing back from the gate, Gabrielle glanced out her window again. The maintenance crew had completed their check and given the all-clear. The complex machinery of the aircraft, each component tested, certified, and functioning in harmony, continued its preparations for flight, indifferent to the human drama unfolding within its fuselage. She knew, however, that Rebecca Palmer was not finished. The flight attendant's expression as she'd walked away had made that clear. This was merely the intermission before the next act. The initial climb out of Dulles had been smooth, the A350 rising effortlessly through scattered clouds into clear blue skies above. The seatbelt sign dinged off and the cabin crew began their service preparations. For a brief moment, Gabrielle hoped that perhaps the confrontation had ended, that Rebecca had reconsidered or found another solution for the Whitmores. That hope evaporated when she saw Rebecca making her way purposefully down the aisle, Flight Service Director Michael Reynolds following close behind her. Michael, a tall man in his early 50s with salt and pepper hair and a perpetually concerned expression, seemed to be trying to interject something. But Rebecca was clearly leading this procession. They stopped at Gabrielle's row, Rebecca positioning herself directly in the aisle, while Michael hung back slightly, his discomfort evident in his body language. "Ma'am," Rebecca began, her voice now carrying an official tone, "I need to speak with you about your continued refusal to comply with crew member instructions." Gabrielle closed her tablet and placed it on the console, giving Rebecca her full attention. "I wasn't aware that declining to give up my assigned seat constituted non-compliance with crew instructions," she replied evenly. Rebecca's jaw tightened. "As I explained earlier, we have elite passengers who need to be seated together. Your refusal is making it difficult for us to accommodate them." Michael Reynolds cleared his throat. "Rebecca, perhaps we should—" "I have this under control, Michael," she interrupted sharply before turning back to Gabrielle. "Ma'am, perhaps you don't understand. Title 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations requires passengers to comply with crew member instructions. Your continued refusal could be considered interference with a crew member performing their duties. The invocation of federal regulations, delivered with authoritative confidence but factual inaccuracy, was the tipping point." Rebecca was now deliberately misrepresenting aviation law to intimidate a passenger into yielding her rightfully assigned seat. Across the aisle, the businessman who had been watching the situation unfold set aside his newspaper completely, no longer pretending disinterest. Behind Rebecca, Sophia had appeared with the beverage cart, but stopped at a distance, her expression a mixture of dismay and fascination. "Are you threatening to have me removed from this flight for declining to give up my assigned seat?" Gabrielle asked, her voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable edge of steel. "I'm informing you of the potential consequences of your actions," Rebecca replied, doubling down. If you continue to be disruptive and non-compliant, yes, we could arrange for authorities to meet the aircraft upon landing in Zurich. Thomas Whitmore, who had been watching eagerly from his seat in row 9, chose this moment to interject again. "Just move her," he called out. "We've wasted enough time on this nonsense." The cabin had gone completely silent now. Even the ambient conversations had ceased as passengers tuned into the confrontation. Someone in row 8 was openly recording with their phone. The air felt charged with tension, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. Gabrielle found herself at a crossroads. She had defended her position firmly but professionally thus far. She could continue this approach, perhaps eventually requesting to speak with the captain. She could reluctantly surrender her seat to avoid further conflict. Or she could reveal her professional identity and authority, a card she rarely played in personal situations, preferring to be treated as any other passenger would be. But this had crossed a line. Rebecca was now falsely citing federal regulations, Gabrielle's area of expertise, to bully her into compliance. The misrepresentation of aviation law wasn't just personally offensive, it was professionally concerning. A memory surfaced from early in her career, her mentor at the FAA, Dr. Eleanor Phillips, addressing a room full of new engineers. The regulations aren't bureaucratic obstacles, she had said. They're written in blood. Every line exists because someone somewhere paid the ultimate price for its absence. Respect them. Defend them. Never misuse them. Rebecca had chosen to weaponize those sacred regulations for something as trivial as a seating preference. "This is your final opportunity to cooperate," Rebecca stated, her tone now openly threatening. "What's your decision?" Gabrielle took a deep breath and made her choice. She reached down and retrieved her briefcase from beneath the seat in front of her, placing it on her lap. The leather was worn at the corners from years of use, the brass clasps dulled with age. It had accompanied her to certification meetings, accident investigations, and international conferences, a constant companion throughout her career at the FAA. "Before I answer," Gabrielle said, her voice dropping to a register of quiet authority that immediately commanded attention. "I'd like you to clarify something for me, Rebecca." She emphasized the flight attendant's name, having noted it on her name tag earlier. "You cited Title 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations. Could you specify which part and section you're referring to that requires me to surrender my assigned seat to another passenger?" Rebecca blinked momentarily, thrown by the precise nature of the question. "It's the part about complying with crew member instructions," she stammered, the certainty in her voice wavering. "You mean 14 CFR 91.111, Gabrielle asked. "Yes, that's it," Rebecca replied, relief evident in her voice at being provided the specific citation. "Interesting," Gabrielle said, unclasping her briefcase with deliberate slowness. "Because 14 CFR 91.111 states, and I quote, 'No person may assault, threaten, intimidate, or interfere with a crew member in the performance of the crew member's duties aboard an aircraft being operated.'" She paused, allowing the actual regulation to hang in the air. Michael Reynolds shifted uncomfortably beside Rebecca, clearly recognizing that something had changed in the dynamic. "The key phrase there," Rebecca Gabrielle continued, "is in the performance of the crew member's duties. Your duties involve ensuring the safety and security of this cabin. They do not extend to coercing passengers to surrender their assigned seats based on the status or preferences of other passengers." Rebecca's face had begun to pale. "I'm not coercing anyone. I'm trying to solve a seating issue." "No," Gabrielle interrupted firmly. "You created a seating issue by attempting to displace me from my assigned seat rather than exploring other solutions. When I declined, you escalated to public pressure tactics. When those failed, you misrepresented federal aviation regulations to threaten me with legal consequences. That is not problem solving. That is harassment and intimidation." A ripple of murmurs spread through the nearby rows. The passenger filming had moved closer to capture the exchange more clearly. With methodical precision, Gabrielle reached into her briefcase and withdrew a leather portfolio. She didn't immediately open it, instead fixing Rebecca with a steady gaze. "Since you've decided to invoke federal aviation regulations," Gabrielle said, her voice now carrying the unmistakable weight of authority, "I believe it's important that we're all clear on what they actually state and who enforces them." Rebecca's expression had shifted from confidence to growing uncertainty. Something about Gabrielle's demeanor had changed. A subtle transformation from defensive passenger to something else entirely. "Who exactly do you think you are?" Thomas Whitmore called, from his seat, his voice carrying a note of derision. Gabrielle didn't respond to him directly. Instead, she opened the leather portfolio to reveal an official government credential. The gold-embossed seal of the Department of Transportation caught the cabin lighting, the holographic elements shifting as she tilted it slightly toward Rebecca and Michael. "My name is Dr. Gabrielle Morgan," she stated clearly. "I am the director of the Office of Airworthiness Standards at the Federal Aviation Administration. I am an Aviation Safety Inspector, credential number 892-7341. The silence that followed was absolute. Rebecca stared at the credentials, her face draining of all remaining color. Michael Reynolds's eyes widened in recognition and what could only be described as professional horror. From his seat, even Thomas Whitmore had been rendered speechless. For Gabrielle, the moment carried no triumph, only a deep sense of weariness. She hadn't wanted this confrontation. She hadn't wanted to invoke her professional authority in a personal situation. But when aviation regulations, the very rules she had devoted her life to developing and enforcing, were being misused as tools of intimidation, she could not remain silent. Now Gabrielle said, her voice steady and controlled. "I believe it's time we discussed the actual violation of federal regulations that's occurred on this flight." The government credential lay open in Gabrielle's hands, commanding the complete attention of everyone within view. The leather folio displayed not just a photo ID and a job title, but a symbol of federal authority that carried genuine weight in the aviation world, especially within the confined space of an aircraft cabin. Rebecca Palmer stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, no words forthcoming. The transformation was remarkable. Seconds earlier, she had been the picture of assertive authority. Now she appeared physically diminished, as if the cabin pressure had suddenly changed around her alone. Beside her, Michael Reynolds had gone equally still, though his expression conveyed a different emotion, the dawning recognition of a professional catastrophe unfolding in real time. Gabrielle allowed a moment for the reality to sink in before continuing. "Rebecca," she said, her voice calm but carrying easily through the silent cabin, "you cited federal regulations as the basis for your threat. I'd like you to be more specific. Which regulation exactly would I be violating by occupying the seat that I legally purchased?" The question hung in the air. Rebecca's eyes darted from the credential to Gabrielle's face, then to Michael silently pleading for assistance. When none came, she stammered, "It's failure to comply with crew member instructions." "That's correct," Gabrielle acknowledged with a slight nod. 14 CFR 121.5580 states that no person may interfere with a crew member in the performance of their duties. However, that regulation pertains to safety-related instructions, not preferential seating arrangements. She turned the credential slightly, ensuring the holographic DOT seal caught the light. "The regulations you've invoked are designed to ensure cabin safety and security. They exist to protect passengers and crew during emergencies, to prevent genuine disruptions, and to maintain the integrity of flight operations. They are not tools to be used for customer service disputes or to pressure passengers into surrendering their assigned seats." The businessman across the aisle had abandoned all pretense of disinterest, watching the exchange with undisguised fascination. Behind Rebecca, Sophia had moved closer, her eyes wide as she observed the dramatic reversal of fortune. I was just trying to resolve a seating issue," Rebecca managed her voice barely above a whisper. "No," Gabrielle countered firmly. "You created a situation." You selected me as the passenger most likely to yield to pressure. When I declined, you escalated to public intimidation. When that failed, you misrepresented federal aviation regulations to threaten me with legal consequences." She closed the credential folio deliberately, but kept it visible on her tray table. "That misrepresentation is actually the more serious issue here. As an FAA official, I cannot ignore the deliberate misuse of regulations as a coercion tactic." From several rows back, Thomas Whitmore had recovered enough to attempt reasserting himself into the conversation. "This is ridiculous," he called out, though his voice lacked its previous confidence. "All this over a simple seat change." Gabrielle didn't acknowledge him directly, maintaining her focus on Rebecca and Michael. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, addressing the flight service director, "I assume you're familiar with Atlantic Global's policies regarding crew conduct and passenger rights." Michael nodded stiffly, finding his voice at last. "Yes, ma'am, I am." "Then you understand the seriousness of what's occurred here." "I do," he confirmed, then turned to Rebecca. "Rebecca, I think we need to step back to the galley and discuss this situation privately." But Rebecca seemed unable to move, her professional composure shattered by the revelation. The cabin remained eerily silent, passengers barely breathing as they watched the scene unfold. The passenger who had been filming, a young tech entrepreneur named Kevin Townsend, had captured the entire exchange. His phone remained raised, documenting the moment when assumed authority collided with the genuine article. Rebecca Gabrielle said, her tone softening slightly. "I understand you were trying to solve a problem, but the method you chose was inappropriate and potentially violated the rights of a passenger. That is not a minor issue, especially when federal regulations are misrepresented." Something in Rebecca's expression shifted, a flicker of defiance returning as she grasped for her crumbling authority. "I was acting in the best interests of all passengers," she insisted. "The Whitmores are premier platinum members. They expect certain accommodations." "Status does not override assigned seating," Gabrielle replied simply. "And it certainly doesn't justify threatening a passenger with regulatory action for declining to move." From the forward galley, a new figure appeared. Captain James Wilson, alerted by Sophia's earlier call to the flight deck. His presence brought an immediate shift in the cabin atmosphere, his captain's uniform carrying its own unmistakable authority. "What's the situation here?" he asked, his voice carrying the calm confidence of someone who had managed countless in-flight crises. Michael stepped forward quickly. "Captain, we have a situation that requires your attention." Gabrielle remained seated, her credentials still visible on the tray table, her expression composed. As Captain Wilson approached, his eyes fell to the credential recognition dawning immediately on his face. The dynamic had shifted once again. In the hierarchy of an aircraft, the captain's authority was absolute, but even captains answered to the FAA. Captain James Wilson surveyed the scene before him, his experienced eyes quickly assessing the situation. A 25-year veteran with Atlantic Global, he had managed equipment failures, medical emergencies, and severe turbulence with unflappable calm. This, however, was a different category of in-flight incident, one with potentially serious professional consequences. "Dr. Morgan," he said, his voice carrying respect rather than the condescension Rebecca had shown. "I'm Captain James Wilson." "What seems to be the issue here?" Gabrielle gestured to her credential on the tray table. "Captain Wilson, I'm Dr. Gabrielle Morgan, Director of Airworthiness Standards at the FAA. I've been subjected to harassment by your flight attendant, Ms. Palmer, who attempted to force me to surrender my assigned seat to accommodate other passengers. When I declined, she misrepresented federal aviation regulations and threatened me with removal from the aircraft." Captain Wilson's expression remained professional, but his jaw tightened noticeably. He turned to Rebecca. "Is this accurate, Ms. Palmer?" Rebecca seemed to shrink under his gaze. "I was trying to resolve a seating issue with the Whitmores. They're Premier Platinum members who were separated due to a system glitch. That doesn't answer my question, the captain said evenly. Did you threaten Dr. Morgan with regulatory action for declining to give up her assigned seat? I informed her of the consequences of failing to comply with crew instructions. Rebecca replied, her voice uncertain. Rebecca. Michael interjected his tone, conveying the seriousness of the situation. Did you cite federal regulations as the basis for asking Dr. Morgan to move? Yes, but that's enough, Captain Wilson said, cutting off her explanation. He turned back to Gabrielle. Dr. Morgan, on behalf of Atlantic Global and this crew, I offer my sincere apologies for this incident. This is completely unacceptable and unprofessional behavior that does not reflect our airline's policies or values. The transformation in the cabin was palpable. The power dynamic hadn't merely shifted. It had been completely inverted. Rebecca stood silent now, her earlier authority evaporated. Michael Reynolds had moved slightly away from her, a subtle but significant distancing. From their seats, the Whitmores watched with expressions of growing dismay. The audience that had earlier seemed to empower Rebecca now bore witness to her professional undoing. Captain Wilson turned toward the Whitmores. Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, you have two options. You may remain in your assigned seats for this flight, or we can arrange alternative transportation for you on a later service. There will be no further discussion about changing Dr. Morgan's seat assignment. Thomas Whitmore, his face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and anger, remained silent for once. Amanda clutched her designer handbag tighter, her Instagram-ready smile nowhere to be seen. The captain then addressed Rebecca directly. Ms. Palmer, you are relieved of cabin duties for the remainder of this flight. Report to the aft galley. Ms. Rodriguez will take over your responsibilities in the forward cabin. The words fell like a hammer blow. To be removed from duty mid-flight was the ultimate professional humiliation, a public declaration of failure that would require formal documentation in her employment record. Captain, that's not necessary, Rebecca protested weakly. I was just trying to... It is both necessary and appropriate, he interrupted firmly. Mr. Reynolds will escort you to the aft galley. We will discuss this matter further upon arrival in Zurich. Michael nodded, gesturing for Rebecca to precede him toward the rear of the aircraft. She moved woodenly, her face a mask of shock and disbelief, avoiding eye contact with passengers who now watched her with expressions ranging from sympathy to contempt. As Rebecca disappeared toward the rear, Captain Wilson turned back to Gabrielle. Again, Dr. Morgan, my sincere apologies. Is there anything we can do to make the remainder of your flight more comfortable? Thank you, Captain, but no, Gabrielle replied. I appreciate your professionalism in handling the situation. Captain Wilson nodded respectfully. If you need anything at all during the flight, please ask for me directly. He glanced around at the other passengers, many of whom were still watching intently. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for any disturbance. We'll be continuing our service shortly and expect a smooth flight to Zurich. With that, he returned to the flight deck, leaving a transformed cabin in his wake. Sophia quickly moved to resume the interrupted beverage service, her manner professional, but with a new undertone of deference when she reached Gabrielle's seat. The Whitmores had retreated into stony silence, Thomas staring fixedly out his window while Amanda busied herself with her phone, though her social media accounts would remain conspicuously silent about this particular travel experience. Across the aisle, the businessman who had witnessed the entire exchange caught Gabrielle's eye and gave her a small nod of respect. Several other passengers did the same silent acknowledgments of what they had just witnessed. Kevin Townsend, who had been recording, finally lowered his phone. He hesitated, then approached Gabrielle's seat. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "I just wanted to say, that was incredible. The way you stood your ground. It was like watching justice in real time." Gabrielle offered a tired smile. "Thank you. Though I would have preferred a less eventful flight. "Would you mind if I asked what you do at the FAA?" Kevin inquired. "I mean, besides putting entitled flight attendants in their place." "I oversee certification standards for aircraft structures and materials," she replied simply. "Ensuring that every component meets safety requirements before it ever leaves the ground." Kevin nodded appreciatively. "So you literally make sure planes stay in the air. That's actually amazing." With that, he returned to his seat, leaving Gabrielle to finally settle back into the quiet she had sought from the beginning. The confrontation was over, but the ripple effects were just beginning. For Rebecca Palmer, for Atlantic Global, and for an aviation culture where such incidents occurred far too frequently. Gabrielle reopened her tablet, returning to her presentation notes. The symposium in Zurich still awaited, and she had work to complete. But as she reviewed her materials on composite material safety factors, she couldn't help but reflect on a different kind of structural integrity. The kind that allows a person to stand firm when pressured to yield space they have rightfully claimed. The remaining 7 hours of Atlantic Global Flight 847 proceeded with a markedly different atmosphere than its tumultuous beginning. The business class cabin, typically characterized by quiet efficiency, now operated with an almost exaggerated attentiveness. Sofia Rodriguez had assumed Rebecca's duties, moving through the cabin with a warm professionalism that stood in stark contrast to her predecessor's approach. Gabrielle settled back into her work rhythm, using the time to refine key points in her symposium presentation. The controversy had consumed valuable preparation time, but she compartmentalized it with the same disciplined focus she applied to complex certification challenges. The aircraft engines hummed steadily outside her window, a constant reminder of the engineering precision she had dedicated her career to upholding. Midway through the flight, as most passengers dozed under dimmed cabin lighting, Michael Reynolds approached her seat. His manner was subdued, professional contrition evident in every movement. "Dr. Morgan," he began quietly, "I wanted to personally apologize again for what occurred earlier. It was completely unacceptable." Gabrielle set aside her tablet. "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. I appreciate that. He hesitated, then continued with the careful phrasing of someone navigating professional quicksand. "If you don't mind my asking, will this incident result in an official FAA report?" The question revealed his real concern, not just the personal apology, but the potential regulatory consequences for the airline. "It already has," Gabrielle replied candidly. When federal aviation regulations are misrepresented to passengers as a coercion tactic, that becomes an official concern. However, she added, noting his expression, "My report will focus on the specific incident and the need for corrective action in crew training protocols. This isn't about punitive measures against Atlantic Global as a whole." Michael nodded relief, mingling with continued concern. "We take crew conduct very seriously. This is not how we train our teams to handle seating issues." "And yet it happened," Gabrielle observed, "which suggests there may be informal practices that deviate from official training." Her words struck a nerve. Michael glanced away briefly, then nodded. "You're right. There are unwritten approaches to problem solving that develop over time. This has been a wake-up call." A passenger in a nearby seat stirred slightly, and Michael lowered his voice further. "Captain Wilson asked me to inform you that he's documenting the entire incident in his flight report and will be submitting it to our Chief of Operations before we even land in Zurich." "Good," Gabrielle said simply. "Transparency is essential in addressing these issues." As Michael returned to his duties, Gabrielle reflected on the broader implications of what had occurred. This wasn't just about one flight attendant's misconduct or her own personal experience. It represented a pattern she had observed throughout the aviation industry, the way certain passengers were deemed more valuable than others, how assumptions about who belonged in premium cabins influenced crew behavior, and how authority could be misused when unchecked. Later in the flight, as the first hints of dawn appeared on the eastern horizon, Captain Wilson himself emerged from the flight deck during his break. He made a point of stopping at Gabrielle's seat. "Dr. Morgan," he said, his voice carrying the measured tone of command, "I wanted to check that everything has been satisfactory since our earlier situation." "Yes, Captain. Thank you," she replied. "Ms. Rodriguez has been excellent." He nodded, then lowered his voice. "I should mention that I recognize your name from your work on the Composite Materials Certification Framework. It's been required reading for captains transitioning to the A350 fleet. Your standards are the reason we can fly these aircraft with complete confidence." The recognition of her professional contributions, offered respectfully colleague to colleague, stood in marked contrast to how she had initially been treated on the flight. "That's good to hear," Gabrielle said. "The framework was the result of many people's efforts, but I'm pleased it's serving its purpose." "It certainly is," Wilson affirmed. "Every time I look at these composite wings flexing during turbulence, I'm grateful for the rigorous standards behind them." After the captain returned to the flight deck, Gabrielle turned to watch the gradual lightening of the sky outside her window. The aircraft was beginning its gradual descent toward the Swiss Alps, the curvature of the earth visible on the distant horizon. Below, the lights of European cities twinkled like earthbound constellations. As the fasten seatbelt sign illuminated for landing, Gabrielle stowed her materials and prepared for arrival. The Whitmores had remained notably silent for the remainder of the flight, their earlier entitlement seemingly diminished by the public revelation of their behavior. Several times during the flight, she had caught Thomas glancing in her direction, his expression unreadable. Sophia distributed landing cards and offered a final round of beverages before touchdown. When she reached Gabrielle's seat, there was respect in her eyes that went beyond standard customer service. "Dr. Morgan," she said quietly as she collected Gabrielle's empty water glass. "Thank you." The simple statement carried layers of meaning that needed no elaboration. Sophia, who had witnessed Rebecca's behavior from a position of limited power to intervene, was expressing gratitude not just for Gabrielle's personal stand, but for the accountability that might prevent similar incidents in the future. As the A350 descended through scattered clouds toward Zurich International Airport, Gabrielle felt a complex mixture of emotions. The vindication of standing her ground was tempered by the exhaustion that always accompanied such confrontations. There was no triumph in having to defend her right to occupy space she had legitimately claimed, only a weary satisfaction that she had done so successfully. The gentle bump of landing gear touching Swiss tarmac signaled the end of Atlantic Global Flight 847, but only the beginning of the consequences that would unfold from a routine business class dispute that had escalated into something much more significant. For Rebecca Palmer, for the Whitmores, for Atlantic Global Airlines, and for an industry that still struggled with the basic principle that all passengers deserving equal respect, regardless of appearance, background, or assumptions about where they belonged. The grand ballroom of the Zurich International Conference Center hummed with the particular energy unique to gatherings of experts passionate about their field. Hundreds of aviation professionals from around the world, engineers, regulators, manufacturers, and airline representatives, had assembled for the International Aviation Safety Symposium, one of the industry's most prestigious technical events. Dr. Gabrielle Morgan stood at the podium, her presentation on next-generation composite materials displayed on the massive screen behind her. Despite the disrupted flight and minimal rest, she projected confident authority as she addressed the assembled experts. "The challenge we face isn't just developing new materials," she explained, "manipulating the remote to display a complex stress analysis graph, but creating certification frameworks that accurately predict their performance throughout an aircraft's lifespan. Traditional metal fatigue models simply don't apply to carbon fiber reinforced polymers." The audience was rapt, many taking notes as Gabrielle guided them through the technical intricacies of her research. This was her element, the precise world of material science, structural integrity, and safety margins, where her expertise was unquestioned. "What we've developed at the FAA," she continued advancing to the next slide, "is a multimodal testing protocol that accounts for the unique characteristics of composite delamination under varied stress conditions." From the third row, Dr. Hans Müller from Airbus nodded appreciatively. Beside him, representatives from Boeing Bombardier and Embraer were equally engaged, recognizing the significance of the work being presented. These were her peers, the engineers and scientists who understood the critical importance of the standards she helped establish. "The certification pathway I'm proposing today," Gabrielle said, nearing her conclusion, "would standardize these testing protocols across all regulatory jurisdictions, ensuring consistent safety standards, regardless of where an aircraft is manufactured or certified." As she fielded questions from the audience, navigating complex technical challenges with ease, no one would have guessed the ordeal she had endured just hours earlier. Her responses were measured, authoritative, and precise. The same qualities she had displayed in the confrontation aboard Flight 847, but now directed toward advancing aviation safety rather than defending her personal dignity. When the session ended, Gabrielle was approached by a young woman in her early 30s, Dr. Amara Okafor, a promising materials scientist from the European Union Aviation Safety Agency. Dr. Morgan Amara began her expression, conveying genuine admiration. "Your work on thermal expansion differentials in hybrid composites is revolutionary. I've based much of my research on your methodologies." Gabrielle smiled warmly. "That's gratifying to hear. I've actually read your paper on microcrack propagation in layered composites. Excellent work." Amara beamed at the recognition. "Thank you. Well, as one of the few black women in my department, your career has been something of a blueprint for me. The way you've navigated this industry while maintaining scientific rigor and integrity is remarkable." The comment touched Gabrielle more deeply than Amara could know, especially following the events of the flight. Here was the next generation of aviation professionals building upon foundations she had helped establish, facing many of the same challenges she had encountered throughout her career. "The industry is changing," Gabrielle replied, though not as quickly as we might hope. "The important thing is that you're at the table when decisions are made. Your voice matters." "Speaking of which," Amara said, lowering her voice slightly, "there's quite a buzz about something that happened on your flight. Someone from Atlantic Global mentioned an incident with a flight attendant, and an FAA official news traveled fast in aviation circles, particularly when it involved regulatory authorities." Gabrielle maintained her professional composure, unwilling to fuel gossip. "There was a misunderstanding about seating assignments," she said simply. "It's being addressed through appropriate channels." Amara nodded, understanding the discretion. "Well, whatever happened, I'm glad you made it here. Your presentation was the highlight of the symposium so far." As they parted ways, Gabrielle checked her phone and found several messages from Director William Blackwood at FAA headquarters, requesting an update on the incident. She also noticed an email from Atlantic Global's Executive Vice President of Operations, someone she had met at industry events, expressing deep concern about what had transpired on Flight 847. Throughout the remainder of the day, Gabrielle participated in panel discussions, technical breakout sessions, and the inevitable networking that accompanied such conferences. Several colleagues made oblique references to the incident, which was clearly spreading through the aviation community's informal communication channels. During an afternoon coffee break, she encountered Captain James Wilson in the conference center lobby. He had been scheduled to attend the symposium as Atlantic Global's representative even before their paths had crossed on Flight 847. "Dr. Morgan," he greeted her with professional respect. "I was hoping to see you here. Your presentation was excellent, especially considering the circumstances of your journey." "Thank you, Captain," she replied. "I understand you'll be participating in the Crew Resource Management panel tomorrow." He nodded. "Yes, though ironically recent events have provided a case study I hadn't anticipated including in my remarks. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from unexpected places," Gabrielle observed. Wilson's expression turned more serious. "I want you to know that I submitted my full report as soon as we landed. Our Chief of Operations has already reviewed it and assures me that appropriate action will be taken." "I appreciate your professionalism," Gabrielle said. both during the incident and afterward. As she returned to the conference sessions, Gabrielle reflected on the stark contrast between her treatment on the aircraft and the respect she commanded in these professional settings. In the symposium environment, her expertise was recognized and valued without question. Her right to occupy space, physical and intellectual, was taken for granted. The incident on Flight 847 had thrown that disparity into sharp relief. Same person, same credentials, entirely different assumptions based on context and appearance. When the day's sessions concluded, Gabrielle returned to her hotel room and dedicated an hour to drafting 2 carefully worded emails. The first went to Atlantic Global's executive leadership, detailing the incident with clinical precision and recommending specific improvements to crew training protocols. The second went to Director Blackwood, officially documenting the misrepresentation of FAA regulations and requesting a formal review of how aviation regulations were being interpreted and applied by cabin crews across the industry. Neither email was vengeful or emotional. Both focused on structural improvements rather than individual punishment. This approach had defined Gabrielle's career, identifying weaknesses in systems and developing robust solutions that would prevent future failures. As she prepared for the symposium dinner that evening, Gabrielle knew that her actions would have consequences extending far beyond one flight attendant or one airline. The incident had created an opportunity to address deeper issues within aviation culture, an opportunity she intended to use wisely and effectively. The response from Atlantic Global Airlines came swiftly and at the highest levels. By the morning after Gabrielle's emails, her phone displayed a message from CEO Richard Harrington himself requesting a private meeting at her convenience during the symposium. They met in a quiet corner of the hotel's executive lounge, away from the bustle of the main conference areas. Harrington, a former pilot who had worked his way into the corporate suite, carried himself with the direct manner of someone accustomed to addressing problems head-on. "Dr. Morgan," he began after preliminary pleasantries. "I want to personally apologize for what happened aboard Flight 847. It was inexcusable and entirely contrary to our values and policies as an organization." Gabrielle nodded, appreciating the direct approach. "Thank you for acknowledging that, Mr. Harrington. I've reviewed Captain Wilson's report as well as statements from Mr. Reynolds and several passengers," he continued. "The behavior exhibited by Ms. Palmer was completely unacceptable, particularly the misrepresentation of federal regulations. That aspect is particularly concerning from the FAA's perspective," Gabrielle noted. "Regulations exist to ensure safety, not as tools for passenger manipulation." Harrington nodded grimly. "Absolutely. We've already launched a comprehensive internal investigation. Ms. Palmer has been placed on immediate administrative leave pending its outcome. But I want to assure you this goes beyond one employee. We're examining how our training protocols may have contributed to this situation." "That's encouraging to hear," Gabrielle replied. "My concern is not with individual punishment, but with addressing underlying patterns that allow such incidents to occur." On that front, Harrington said, "I'd like to discuss your recommendations for improving our crew training. Your email contained several specific suggestions that our training department is already evaluating." They spent the next half hour discussing practical changes to Atlantic Global's approach to passenger management seating disputes and proper application of regulatory authority. Throughout the conversation, Harrington maintained a tone of genuine commitment to improvement rather than mere damage control. "One last thing, Dr. Morgan," he said as their meeting concluded. "I understand you declined any form of compensation for this incident." "That's correct," she confirmed. "This isn't about personal benefit." "I respect that position," Harrington replied. "But I want you to know that we're establishing a scholarship fund for underrepresented students pursuing aviation careers, with an emphasis on regulatory and safety specialties. We'd be honored if you would consider serving on the selection committee." The gesture was meaningful. Not a private compensation that would disappear into her bank account, but a structural change that might help address the broader issues at play. "I'd be happy to participate in that initiative," Gabrielle said. Thank you for taking this approach. Back at the symposium, Gabrielle found a message waiting from Director William Blackwood. His response to her report was equally swift, though more bureaucratically framed than Harrington's direct approach. Dr. Morgan. The message began. I've initiated a formal inquiry based on your report regarding the misrepresentation of regulations aboard Atlantic Global 847. Investigator Alejandro Ramirez from our Compliance Division has been assigned to the case and will be contacting you for a detailed statement. The message continued with appropriate expressions of concern and support, concluding with a personal note. Off the record, Gabrielle, well done. Standing your ground was not just the right thing for you personally, but a service to our entire regulatory framework. Let me know if you need anything from my office. By that afternoon, Gabrielle had received an email from Investigator Ramirez requesting a time to take her formal statement. They arranged to meet the following day between symposium sessions. Alejandro Ramirez proved to be methodical and thorough, his investigative approach reflecting his background as both a former commercial pilot and an attorney specializing in aviation law. In a quiet meeting room at the conference center, he recorded Gabrielle's account of the incident, occasionally stopping to ask clarifying questions. When Ms. Palmer specifically cited federal regulations, he asked at one point, "Do you recall her exact wording?" Gabrielle provided the details with precision, her memory for technical accuracy serving her well in this context. Ramirez nodded as he took notes, his expression giving nothing away. Based on your professional experience, he continued, would you characterize this as an isolated misunderstanding of regulations? Or does it suggest a pattern of misuse? I believe it indicates a broader pattern, Gabrielle replied carefully. The confidence with which she invoked regulations suggests this was not her first time using them in this manner. Additionally, her senior position implies that such tactics may be informally modeled for junior crew members. Ramirez nodded thoughtfully. That aligns with preliminary findings from our broader inquiry. We've initiated a cross-carrier review of similar incidents to determine if this represents an industry-wide issue, rather than an isolated occurrence. The implication was significant. What had begun as a single confrontation on one flight was expanding into a regulatory examination that could potentially affect training protocols across multiple airlines. As the interview concluded, Ramirez closed his notebook and spoke more informally. Dr. Morgan, I've been with the FAA for 15 years, and I've seen how regulations can be misinterpreted both accidentally and deliberately. What happened on your flight crosses an important line. Using safety regulations as leverage in customer service disputes undermines the very foundation of our regulatory authority. I couldn't agree more, Gabrielle said. That's precisely why I felt compelled to report it formally rather than simply letting it go as an unpleasant personal experience. Ramirez nodded. Well, your report has certainly set things in motion. Atlantic Global is conducting their internal investigation, but our inquiry will look at the broader implications across the industry. We'll be reviewing crew training materials from major carriers to assess how regulations are being presented to flight crews. After Ramirez departed, Gabrielle returned to the symposium's technical sessions, her mind shifting back to composite material stress tolerances and certification frameworks. Yet throughout the day, she received periodic updates that indicated the expanding ripple effects of the incident. An email from Sofia Rodriguez confirmed that she had provided her statement to both Atlantic Global's internal investigation and the FAA inquiry, detailing not only the specific incident but other concerning behaviors she had observed from Rebecca Palmer over their time working together. Meanwhile, Atlantic Global's public relations department was grappling with a growing situation on social media. Kevin Townsend, the passenger who had recorded part of the confrontation, had posted a carefully edited version that showed Rebecca's threatening behavior while respecting Gabrielle's privacy. The video was gaining traction online with the hashtag #RespectInFlight beginning to trend on several platforms. By evening, what had begun as a personal stand for dignity and respect had transformed into a multifaceted examination of power, authority, and accountability within the aviation industry. The professional consequences were extending far beyond what anyone might have anticipated when Rebecca Palmer first approached Seat 5D with her unreasonable demand, and the investigations were just beginning. Alejandro Ramirez sat in his temporary office at the FAA's European Liaison headquarters in Frankfurt, surrounded by stacks of documents. What had begun as an investigation into a single incident had expanded into something far more comprehensive as patterns began to emerge. "It's worse than we thought," he told his colleague via secure video conference. The initial review of crew training materials shows significant inconsistencies in how federal regulations are presented to flight attendants across multiple carriers. On his desk lay Rebecca Palmer's personnel file obtained through formal channels from Atlantic Global. The thick folder contained 25 years of performance reviews, training certifications, and incident reports. Most striking was what it didn't contain: any record of disciplinary action despite multiple passenger complaints documented over the years. Ramirez had been methodically cross-referencing Palmer's flight schedules against her training records when he noticed a discrepancy that couldn't be explained by simple administrative error. On at least 4 occasions over the past 3 years, Palmer's records indicated she had attended mandatory recurrent training sessions on dates when flight logs showed her working international routes. This discovery had prompted a deeper examination of Atlantic Global's certification previous complaints involving similar behavior, selective enforcement of policies based on perceived passenger status, intimidation tactics, and misrepresentation of airline authority. Richard Harrington, who had met with Gabrielle in Zurich, leaned forward with a troubled expression. "Why wasn't this pattern flagged earlier?" "That's the concerning part," Rivera replied. "Many of these complaints were dismissed at the department level without proper investigation. There appears to be an informal practice of protecting senior crew members, particularly those with Palmer's tenure." The revelation prompted a widening of the investigation to examine how passenger complaints were processed throughout the Atlantic Global system, uncovering a troubling tendency to dismiss certain categories of complaints, particularly those from passengers of color, women traveling alone, and younger travelers. Sofia Rodriguez had provided crucial testimony to both investigations, describing a culture where senior flight attendants like Rebecca Palmer informally trained newer crew members to identify problem passengers based on dubious criteria, including appearance, manner of dress, and racial markers disguised as behavioral indicators. She would tell us which passengers were likely to cause trouble, Sofia had stated in her formal deposition. There was a clear pattern to who got flagged: mostly people of color, especially women traveling alone in premium cabins. We were taught to scrutinize their tickets more closely and to be extra vigilant about their compliance with policies. The FAA investigation took a critical turn when Ramirez discovered that Palmer's falsified training records included required sessions on non-discrimination policies and proper application of federal regulations, the very areas where her conduct had been most problematic. "This isn't just about missing training," Ramirez explained to his supervisor during their secure briefing. "She specifically circumvented the training designed to prevent exactly the kind of behavior she exhibited on Flight 847. The evidence was damning. Palmer had somehow managed to have training records signed off without attending the sessions, a breach of both airline policy and federal requirements for flight attendant certification. More troubling was the discovery that she wasn't alone. The investigation identified at least 7 other senior flight attendants with similar irregularities in their training records. "We need to expand the scope," Ramirez's supervisor instructed. "This suggests a failure in Atlantic Global's verification processes that could have broader safety implications." The investigation now progressed along parallel tracks: Atlantic Global's internal review of Palmer's conduct and the broader cultural issues it reflected, and the FAA's examination of regulatory compliance and training certification across multiple airlines. Meanwhile, the social media attention surrounding the incident continued to grow. Kevin Townsend's video had gone viral with over 3 million views across platforms. The hashtag #RespectInFlight had become a gathering point for passengers sharing similar experiences of mistreatment and discrimination aboard commercial flights. Thomas Whitmore, whose entitled behavior had contributed significantly to the confrontation, found himself facing unexpected consequences of his own. The viral video had clearly captured his dismissive comments and aggressive manner. Within days, his company, Pinnacle Commercial Properties, had been identified by internet sleuths, and their corporate social media accounts were flooded with comments referencing the incident. Pinnacle's CEO, Victoria Lawson, was forwarded the video by multiple employees who recognized Whitmore. After viewing it herself, she called an emergency meeting with her executive team and the company's communications director. "This directly contradicts our public commitment to diversity and inclusion," Lawson stated firmly. "Thomas is representing our company when he travels for business, and this behavior is unacceptable." By the following week, Pinnacle had placed Whitmore on administrative leave, pending an internal review of the incident and its alignment with the company's code of conduct. His wife Amanda found her carefully curated social media presence similarly affected. Her Instagram posts suddenly filled with comments referencing the flight incident, and several wellness brands that had sponsored her content quietly removed their partnerships from their marketing materials. Atlantic Global's internal investigation reached its conclusion first. In a closed-door meeting at corporate headquarters, Rebecca Palmer faced the airline's disciplinary committee. The evidence presented included not only her conduct on Flight 847, but the pattern of similar behavior documented over years, along with the falsified training records. Palmer attempted to defend herself, arguing that she had been trying to solve a customer service problem using methods that had been informally accepted throughout her career. "Everyone does this," she insisted. "We're trained to prioritize our premium passengers. It's understood that we use whatever tools necessary to manage the cabin effectively, including misrepresenting federal regulations," Janet Rivera asked pointedly, "including targeting specific passengers based on appearance rather than actual behavior." Palmer had no effective response. The outcome was decisive termination for cause with a formal notification to the FAA regarding the falsified training records. Palmer's union initially moved to contest the firing but withdrew their support after reviewing the evidence, particularly the documentation falsification, which constituted a clear violation of both company policy and federal requirements. The FAA's investigation continued on a broader scale, with Alejandro Ramirez coordinating a team examining how airlines trained their crews regarding the application of federal regulations. This expanded to include a review of how airlines selected passengers for involuntary reseating, with troubling patterns emerging across multiple carriers. Dr. Gabrielle Morgan received updates on these developments while continuing her professional responsibilities. 2 weeks after the incident, she was back in her Washington office reviewing certification applications for a new composite wing design when Director Blackwood requested a meeting. The Ramirez investigation has uncovered significant issues beyond the original incident, Blackwood explained, sliding a preliminary report across his desk. "This isn't just about one flight attendant or one airline. It's revealing industry-wide problems in how regulations are interpreted and applied by cabin crews." Gabrielle reviewed the summary findings with professional concern. This confirms what many of us have suspected for years, that there's an informal culture allowing selective enforcement based on perceived passenger value. "Exactly," Blackwood agreed. "And we need to address it at a regulatory level, not just through individual disciplinary actions. I'd like you to lead a task force developing new guidance on the proper application of passenger compliance regulations." The assignment extended beyond Gabrielle's usual technical focus, but the connection was clear. The integrity of regulatory systems, whether applied to aircraft materials or passenger treatment, required the same commitment to consistent standards and evidence-based decision-making. "I'll do it," she said. "But this will require cooperation from the airlines. They need to see this as an opportunity for improvement, not just regulatory enforcement. Richard Harrington at Atlantic Global has already indicated their willingness to serve as a test case for new protocols. Blackwood replied. Their internal investigation has been remarkably thorough and transparent. As Gabrielle left Blackwood's office, her phone buzzed with a text message from Sofia Rodriguez. Thought you should know. RP officially terminated today. New training protocols already being implemented for all crew. Thank you for standing your ground. The simple message conveyed what official reports couldn't. That for the flight attendants who had witnessed or been subjected to Rebecca's behavior over the years, accountability had finally arrived. What had begun as a personal stand for dignity aboard Flight 847 had catalyzed changes that would potentially benefit thousands of passengers and crew members. Not through vengeance or public shaming, but through the methodical application of standards and accountability that had defined Gabrielle's approach throughout her career. Kevin Townsend had initially hesitated before posting the video. As a tech entrepreneur with a modest but engaged Twitter following, he understood the potential consequences of sharing such content. He had carefully edited the footage to focus on Rebecca Palmer's behavior while blurring Gabrielle's face to protect her privacy. Flight attendant demands passenger give up assigned seat, then threatens her with federal regulations. Watch what happens next. Respect. In flight. His caption read. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the video had been viewed over 500,000 times. By the following day, that number had climbed to 3 million, with major news outlets picking up the story and reaching out to Kevin for interviews. I never expected it to go viral like this, he told a CNN reporter during a video interview. I just felt people needed to see how certain passengers are treated based on assumptions about who they are or whether they look like they belong in business class. The hashtag #RespectInFlight quickly evolved from a simple video tag to a movement with thousands of travelers sharing their own experiences of discrimination and mistreatment aboard commercial flights. I'm a black woman with over 2 million miles flown, and I'm still asked to verify my first-class ticket every single time. Respect in flight, wrote one prominent business executive. Flight attendant tried to move me from my assigned seat to accommodate a white couple who wanted to sit together. I paid full fare just like them. Respect. In flight shared another user. The conversation expanded beyond racial discrimination to encompass various forms of bias in air travel. Against disabled passengers, younger travelers, casually dressed business flyers, and others who didn't fit the traditional profile of premium cabin passengers. Atlantic Global's initial response was a carefully worded statement acknowledging an unfortunate incident and promising a full investigation. As the video continued to gain traction, however, they released a more substantive statement. Atlantic Global Airlines is committed to treating all passengers with dignity and respect. The conduct displayed in the recent viral video does not reflect our values or training protocols. We have launched a comprehensive investigation and are taking immediate steps to ensure such incidents never occur again. We are deeply sorry for the distress caused to the passenger involved. Meanwhile, internet users had quickly identified Thomas Whitmore through social media tags and professional networking sites. His role as CFO at Pinnacle Commercial Properties made him easily recognizable, and within days, Pinnacle's corporate social media accounts were flooded with comments and messages. Is this how your executives behave in public? Demanding other passengers give up their seats because they feel entitled to special treatment. Respect. In flight. Your CFO, Thomas Whitmore, showed his true character on that flight. Maybe reconsider your commitment to diversity statement on your website. The pressure intensified when a business publication ran an article titled, Executive Behavior Off the Clock, when personal conduct becomes a corporate liability, using the Atlantic Global incident as its primary case study. Pinnacle's CEO Victoria Lawson issued a statement within days. We are aware of the incident involving our CFO Thomas Whitmore. His actions in the video do not reflect Pinnacle's values of respect and inclusion. Mr. Whitmore has been placed on administrative leave pending a review of the incident. For Amanda Whitmore, the consequences materialized in her carefully cultivated social media presence. As an aspiring wellness influencer with 75,000 Instagram followers, she had built a personal brand around positivity, mindfulness, and authentic living. Her account, Amanda Whitmore. Living featured carefully staged photos of luxury travel, exclusive fitness routines, and inspirational quotes about kindness and gratitude. The disconnect between this curated image and her behavior in the viral video was stark. Comments on her recent posts quickly filled with references to the incident. Is demanding someone give up their seat for you part of your authentic living philosophy? Maybe your next wellness post could be about checking your privilege. Several brands that had provided Amanda with free products in exchange for promotional content quietly removed her from their ambassador programs. Her engagement metrics plummeted, and a scheduled speaking appearance at a wellness conference was canceled. The Whitmores retreated from public view, making their social media accounts private and declining all requests for comment. Sources close to Pinnacle revealed that Thomas was undergoing mandatory sensitivity training as part of the company's review process, with his future at the firm uncertain. Throughout this social media storm, Gabrielle Morgan maintained her characteristic privacy and professionalism. She declined multiple interview requests from news outlets and made no public statements about the incident. Her focus remained on her work at the FAA and the structural changes being implemented in response to the investigations. When a Washington Post reporter managed to reach her by phone, her response was characteristically measured. This incident has highlighted important issues regarding how regulations are interpreted and applied aboard aircraft. I'm pleased that it has prompted meaningful review and improvement of training protocols. Beyond that, I have no personal comment to offer. This restrained approach only enhanced public respect for her. Industry publications like Aviation Weekly ran profiles of her professional accomplishments, highlighting her groundbreaking work on composite material certification and her role in establishing international safety standards. A month after the incident, a major airline industry conference featured a panel discussion titled Authority and Responsibility: Proper Application of Regulations in Passenger Interactions. Although Gabrielle declined to participate directly, her influence was evident in the framework and recommendations presented. Kevin Townsend's video had created a rare moment of public attention focused on the often invisible dynamics of power privilege and accountability in commercial aviation. For many travelers who had experienced similar treatment, the viral incident provided validation and a sense that perhaps meaningful change might finally be possible. And for Atlantic Global Airlines, the public relations crisis had forced an acceleration of reforms that might otherwise have taken years to implement, if they had happened at all. Rebecca Palmer sat across from her union representative in a small conference room at Atlantic Global headquarters, her hands clutching a tissue that she had shredded into tiny pieces during the hour-long disciplinary hearing. "The decision is final," the HR director said, sliding a document across the table. "Termination for cause effective immediately." The documented pattern of passenger mistreatment combined with falsification of training records constitutes grounds for dismissal under both company policy and your union contract. The union representative, who had initially agreed to contest the termination, remained silent. After reviewing the evidence, particularly the falsified training records, she had advised Rebecca that her case had little chance of success. "You can't be serious," Rebecca said, her voice barely above a whisper. 25 years with this airline, and this is how it ends, Ms. Palmer. The HR director replied evenly. "The investigation revealed that you missed mandatory recertification training at least 7 times over the past 3 years, while maintaining signed documentation claiming completion. That alone is grounds for termination." The incident on Flight 847 brought this to light, but these are separate and serious violations. Rebecca's world had collapsed with stunning speed. Her career, the identity she had built over 2.5 decades, was gone. The profession she had fallen back on when her dreams of becoming a pilot had failed was now closed to her permanently. Worse still, Atlantic Global had filed a formal notification with the FAA regarding the falsified training records. This triggered an automatic review of her flight attendant certification, the basic credential required to work for any U.S. airline. 2 weeks later, she received the official notice from the FAA Emergency Order of Revocation of her flight attendant. Certificate of Demonstrated Proficiency. The language was clinical and devastating, based on evidence of willful falsification of required training records. Rebecca Palmer has demonstrated that she lacks the requisite care, judgment, and responsibility required of a certificate holder. The continued exercise of the privileges of her certificate would constitute an unacceptable risk to aviation safety. The revocation was permanent. She would never again work as a flight attendant on any commercial aircraft. Thomas Whitmore's professional fallout unfolded more gradually but proved equally consequential. After 3 weeks on administrative leave, he was called to a meeting with Pinnacle's CEO, Victoria Lawson, and the company's general counsel. Thomas Victoria began her tone formal and distant. "We've completed our review of the airline incident and its alignment with Pinnacle's Code of Conduct and Values Statement." Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The past weeks had been a nightmare of public humiliation and private reflection. His initial indignation had gradually given way to a dawning recognition of how his behavior might have appeared to others. "The board has determined that your actions, which were captured on video and widely distributed, constitute a violation of our executive conduct standards," Victoria continued. "Specifically, your treatment of another passenger and your attempt to leverage your status to displace her from her assigned seat reflect poorly on Pinnacle's commitment to ethical conduct and respect for others." "I understand," Thomas said quietly. "I've had a lot of time to think about my behavior, and I recognize that it was inappropriate. I'm prepared to issue a formal apology and undergo whatever sensitivity training the board deems necessary." Victoria exchanged a glance with the general counsel before continuing. "We appreciate your willingness to acknowledge the issue, Thomas. However, the board has determined that your position as CFO requires not only financial expertise, but also representation of our corporate values in all settings. Given the public nature of this incident and the damage to our brand, we are terminating your employment effective immediately." The severance package was generous but non-negotiable. A detailed non-disparagement clause prohibited Thomas from speaking publicly about his departure. Within hours, Pinnacle issued a press release announcing the appointment of an interim CFO and thanking Thomas for his past contributions, corporate language that signaled a dismissal rather than a resignation. For Amanda Whitmore, the consequences manifested in the collapse of her burgeoning influencer career. Brands that had previously provided free products and paid promotions quietly removed her content from their websites. Her engagement metrics plummeted as followers unsubscribed in droves. Invitations to exclusive wellness events stopped arriving. The couple's social humiliation was complete when they attended a charity gala in Washington, their first public appearance since the incident. Conversations stopped as they entered rooms. Former friends suddenly became deeply engaged with their phones when the Whitmores approached. They left early Amanda in tears, Thomas ashen-faced as they waited for their car at the valet stand. Meanwhile, Atlantic Global was implementing sweeping changes prompted by the dual investigations. Richard Harrington had recognized that the incident represented not just an individual failure, but a breakdown in company culture that required comprehensive reform. The airline announced a complete overhaul of its crew training programs with particular emphasis on passenger rights and the proper application of federal regulations. Every flight attendant would undergo mandatory recertification with new verification protocols to prevent the kind of documentation fraud that Rebecca had engaged in. Most significantly, Atlantic Global developed the Passenger Dignity Initiative, a new approach to resolving seating conflicts and other cabin management issues. The initiative explicitly prohibited using passenger appearance or assumptions about status as factors in decision-making. Instead, it established clear objective criteria for resolving conflicts when they arose. Sofia Rodriguez, whose testimony had been crucial to both investigations, found herself unexpectedly promoted to training coordinator for the airline's East Coast operations. Her new role focused on implementing the revised protocols and ensuring that crew members understood the proper limits of their authority. "We're looking for people who demonstrated integrity during difficult situations," the VP of In-Flight Services told her during the job offer. "Your actions during the Flight 847 incident showed exactly the kind of judgment we need in leadership positions." The FAA's investigation, led by Alejandro Ramirez, expanded to examine similar issues across multiple airlines. His team's findings resulted in an industry-wide advisory on proper application of passenger compliance regulations, a document that explicitly prohibited using federal regulations as leverage in non-safety-related customer service matters. The advisory, which carried regulatory weight, required all U.S. airlines to revise their crew training materials and procedures to ensure compliance. It represented a significant shift in how cabin authority was defined and exercised, one that would potentially benefit millions of passengers for years to come. For Rebecca Palmer Thomas and Amanda Whitmore, the professional consequences of a single flight had proven devastating. Careers ended, reputations damaged, futures uncertain. But for the aviation industry as a whole, the incident had catalyzed meaningful reforms that might otherwise have taken years to implement. And for Dr. Gabrielle Morgan, whose quiet insistence on dignity had sparked these changes, the professional impact was entirely different, a reinforcement of her reputation for integrity and a broadening of her influence beyond technical certification to the human elements of aviation safety. Throughout the public furor and professional investigations, Gabrielle Morgan maintained her characteristic composure and focus. While social media exploded with opinions about the incident and news outlets clamored for interviews, she kept her attention firmly on the structural issues the confrontation had revealed. In her office at FAA headquarters, Gabrielle reviewed the preliminary report from Alejandro Ramirez's investigation. The findings confirmed what she had long suspected, that passenger treatment aboard commercial flights often followed unwritten rules based on appearance, perceived status, and implicit bias, rather than objective policies. This goes well beyond a single incident, she noted during a meeting with Director Blackwood and his senior team. The misapplication of federal regulations as tools of intimidation appears to be widespread, particularly in conflict situations involving passengers from underrepresented groups. Blackwood nodded gravely. "That's why we've expanded the investigation. Ramirez's team is reviewing crew training materials from every major carrier, and the patterns are troubling. There's a significant disconnect between official policies and actual practice." "What's your recommendation?" asked Deputy Director Patricia Alvarez. Gabrielle considered the question carefully. She had already declined multiple opportunities to publicly criticize Rebecca Palmer or Atlantic Global, understanding that individual blame would do little to address the underlying issues. "We need a comprehensive approach," she replied. "First, clear guidance on the proper application of federal regulations in passenger interactions, what cabin crews can and cannot demand in non-safety situations. Second, standardized training requirements across all carriers with verifiable completion tracking. And third, a reporting mechanism for passengers who experience misuse of regulatory authority." Her proposals were approved within days, with Gabrielle appointed to lead the implementation team. This new responsibility came on top of her existing workload overseeing airworthiness certification standards, a testament to the confidence her leadership had in both her technical expertise and her judgment on human factors. Atlantic Global CEO Richard Harrington had requested a meeting with Gabrielle to discuss the airline's reform efforts. She agreed, seeing an opportunity to influence positive change rather than simply punish past misconduct. They met at FAA headquarters, Harrington arriving without the usual entourage of corporate executives or public relations staff. A signal that he wanted a substantive discussion rather than a photo opportunity. Dr. Morgan, he began once they were seated in a conference room. First, let me reiterate my personal apology for what you experienced aboard Flight 847. It was inexcusable and contrary to everything we aspire to as an organization. Thank you, Mr. Harrington, Gabrielle replied. I appreciate your taking this matter seriously. We're implementing the changes I outlined in Zurich, he continued, but I wanted to meet with you directly to ensure we're addressing the core issues rather than just applying superficial fixes. Gabrielle appreciated his candor. The incident revealed two primary concerns from my perspective: the misuse of regulatory authority as a pressure tactic and the apparent targeting of passengers based on assumptions rather than objective criteria. Harrington nodded. Both valid points. We've completely revised our training on federal regulations, explicitly prohibiting their use in non-safety disputes. As for the second issue, we're implementing blind decision-making protocols for seating conflicts, focusing on booking time, fare class, and status level rather than subjective assessments. That's a good start, Gabrielle acknowledged. But cultural change requires more than policy revisions. It needs consistent modeling from leadership and accountability at all levels, which is why we've created a new executive position, VP of Passenger Experience and Inclusion, Harrington explained. This person will report directly to me and have authority to implement and enforce our new protocols across all operations. Their discussion continued for nearly 2 hours, focusing not on blame for past failures, but on concrete steps to prevent future incidents. Gabrielle shared insights from her engineering background about how complex systems fail, rarely due to a single point of failure, but through the interaction of multiple factors and absent safeguards. By the meeting's end, Atlantic Global had gained a surprisingly collaborative relationship with a regulatory official, many airlines viewed primarily as an enforcement threat. Harrington left with a deeper understanding of the structural changes needed, while Gabrielle had secured a valuable industry partner in implementing broader reforms. When requests for media interviews continued to arrive, Gabrielle maintained her policy of polite refusal. She had no interest in becoming the public face of passenger rights or using the incident for personal publicity. Her focus remained on the work itself, the detailed, often unglamorous process of building better systems. The only exception she made was for Aviation Safety Quarterly, a technical journal read primarily by industry professionals. In a thoughtful interview focused on regulatory interpretation and application, she addressed the broader implications without dwelling on personal details. Regulations exist to ensure safety and consistent application of standards, she explained. When they're misused as tools of convenience or intimidation, it undermines the entire regulatory framework. Safety regulations must be applied consistently and correctly, or they lose their meaning and effectiveness. 6 months after the incident, Gabrielle was invited to deliver the keynote address at the International Aviation Professional Association's annual conference. Rather than focusing exclusively on technical certification standards, her usual topic, she broadened her presentation to include the human elements of aviation safety. Technical excellence and human dignity are not separate concerns, she told the audience of industry leaders and regulators. They are interconnected aspects of a truly safe aviation system. An organization that allows bias to influence passenger treatment is likely allowing other subjective factors to influence safety decisions. The same commitment to evidence-based standards must apply to both. The speech received a standing ovation and was subsequently published in several industry journals, extending Gabrielle's influence beyond her technical specialty into the broader conversation about aviation culture and ethics. Throughout this period, she continued receiving updates about the consequences for those directly involved in the Flight 847 incident. She took no pleasure in Rebecca Palmer's termination or the Whitmore's professional difficulties, viewing them not as deserved punishment, but as the natural outcome of actions inconsistent with professional standards and ethical conduct. Her primary satisfaction came from the structural changes implemented across the industry. New training requirements, clearer guidelines on regulatory authority, and accountability mechanisms that would potentially benefit millions of passengers for years to come. When Sofia Rodriguez sent her a message 6 months after the incident, sharing that Atlantic Global's new training program had already reduced passenger complaints by 37%, Gabrielle felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. This was the outcome she had sought, not public vindication or personal revenge, but meaningful improvement to a flawed system. Through her measured response to a deeply personal affront, Dr. Gabrielle Morgan had demonstrated the same qualities that defined her professional approach to aviation safety: a commitment to evidence standards and the enduring belief that systems could always be improved with the right combination of technical expertise and ethical clarity. The conference room at FAA headquarters buzzed with focused energy as representatives from major airlines, crew unions, and regulatory agencies gathered around the large oval table. At the head of the table, Dr. Gabrielle Morgan prepared to unveil what had informally become known throughout the industry as the Morgan Standards, a comprehensive framework for cabin crew authority and passenger rights. "Thank you all for being here today." Gabrielle began, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had become her signature. 6 months ago, we identified significant inconsistencies in how federal regulations were being interpreted and applied in cabin management situations. Today, we're introducing a standardized framework to address those issues. On the screens around the room appeared a detailed document titled Standardized Guidelines for Regulatory Application in Non-Safety Cabin Management. Though the official title was characteristically technical, everyone present knew they were looking at the Morgan Standards, a direct result of the Flight 847 incident and the investigations it had triggered. These guidelines establish clear boundaries between safety-related directives which passengers must follow without question, and customer service matters where different protocols apply. Gabrielle explained, navigating through the document's key sections. Most importantly, they explicitly prohibit using federal regulations as leverage in non-safety disputes, such as seating assignments. Richard Harrington, representing Atlantic Global as both CEO and industry pioneer in implementing these reforms, nodded in agreement. In the 6 months since the incident, his airline had transformed its approach to crew training and passenger interaction, becoming an unexpected leader in equity initiatives. Atlantic Global has already implemented many of these guidelines, Harrington confirmed when invited to speak. Our preliminary data shows a 37% reduction in passenger complaints related to crew conduct, with particular improvement in feedback from passengers of color and solo female travelers. The presentation continued with detailed implementation timelines, verification requirements, and reporting mechanisms. What had begun as a personal stand aboard Flight 847 had evolved into a comprehensive reform of industry practices, a remarkable transformation that few could have predicted when Rebecca Palmer first approached Seat 5D with her unreasonable demand. Among the attendees was Sofia Rodriguez, now Atlantic Global's training coordinator for passenger experience. Her career had accelerated dramatically in the months following the incident, her willingness to speak truthfully during the investigations, marking her as someone with both integrity and leadership potential. Our new training protocols focus on objective decision-making rather than subjective assessment, Sofia explained during her portion of the presentation. Flight attendants are taught to apply consistent standards regardless of a passenger's appearance, age, race, or perceived status. The cornerstone of these new protocols was the Equity in Travel initiative, which had replaced Atlantic Global's previous hierarchical approach to passenger management. Under the new system, conflicts were resolved using transparent criteria, booking time, fare class, and operational requirements, with clear documentation requirements for any decisions affecting passenger seating or service. Most significantly, The industry had implemented a digital verification system for crew training, directly addressing the falsified records that had allowed Rebecca Palmer's misconduct to continue unchecked for years. Now, training completion required biometric verification, cross-referenced with flight schedules to prevent the kind of fraud that had previously gone undetected. After the presentation, attendees broke into working groups to discuss implementation challenges specific to their organizations. Gabrielle circulated among them, answering questions and providing clarification on technical points. The atmosphere was collaborative rather than adversarial, a rare achievement in the often contentious relationship between airlines and regulators. During a break, Sophia approached Gabrielle privately. "I wanted to tell you something that wouldn't be appropriate to share in the official session," she said quietly. "Rebecca has been struggling to find employment since her certification was revoked. Last I heard, she was working at a retail store near Dulles Airport." Gabrielle nodded, taking in the information without visible reaction. "And the Whitmores?" "Thomas eventually found another position, but at a much smaller firm and lower compensation," Sophia replied. "Amanda has largely disappeared from social media. Their lawsuit against Atlantic Global for defamation was dismissed last month." The conversation was interrupted as Richard Harrington approached, accompanied by a young black woman in her early 20s. "Dr. Morgan," he said, "I'd like to introduce Zoe Washington, our first recipient of the Atlantic Global Diversity in Aviation Scholarship. She's studying aerospace engineering at Howard University and will be interning with our safety division this summer." Zoe extended her hand with a confidence that reminded Gabrielle of herself at that age. "It's an honor to meet you, Dr. Morgan. Your work on composite certification frameworks was the subject of my advanced materials project last semester. Excellent choice of topic," Gabrielle replied with a genuine smile. "The intersection of material science and safety standards offers tremendous opportunities for innovation." As they discussed Zoe's academic interests and career aspirations, Gabrielle reflected on the unexpected outcomes of the Flight 847 incident. What had begun as a personal affront had catalyzed meaningful changes that would benefit countless passengers and crew members, including creating opportunities for young people like Zoe to enter the aviation field with stronger support systems than had existed before. The transformation wasn't limited to Atlantic Global. Airlines across the industry were implementing similar reforms, partly due to regulatory pressure, but increasingly because they recognized the business benefits of equitable treatment. Passenger satisfaction scores improved, social media sentiment became more positive, and crew members reported greater job satisfaction under the clearer guidelines. Even the physical spaces of air travel were changing. Atlantic Global had redesigned their gate areas and check-in processes to reduce opportunities for bias in customer interactions. Automated systems now handled many decisions previously left to individual discretion, with transparent criteria and documentation requirements when human judgment was necessary. As the meeting concluded and participants departed with implementation plans for their respective organizations, Gabrielle gathered her materials, satisfied with the progress, but aware that sustaining these changes would require ongoing vigilance and commitment. The Morgan Standards represented not just a policy document, but a fundamental shift in how authority was exercised in commercial aviation, from subjective judgment, often influenced by bias, to objective criteria consistently applied. It was a transformation that would touch the experiences of millions of travelers for years to come, all stemming from one woman's refusal to surrender her rightfully claimed space. The grand ballroom of the Washington Aviation Club glowed with subdued elegance as industry leaders gathered for the annual Excellence in Aviation Awards. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables adorned with elaborate floral arrangements, while a string quartet played softly in the background. At the front of the room, a podium stood beside a table displaying the evening's awards, including the prestigious Catherine Wright Medal for contributions to aviation safety and advancement. Named after the Wright brothers' sister, whose support had been crucial to their success, the award recognized individuals whose work had transformed aviation in significant ways. Dr. Gabrielle Morgan sat at a table near the front, accompanied by colleagues from the FAA and several industry partners. She wore a deep blue evening gown, her father's watch still on her wrist, a connection to her roots even in this rarefied setting. After dinner and several preliminary awards, FAA Administrator Jonathan Pierce approached the podium to present the night's highest honor. The Catherine Wright Medal recognizes not just technical achievement, but moral leadership in advancing aviation safety and inclusion, he began. This year's recipient has demonstrated both in extraordinary measure. As he detailed Gabrielle's professional accomplishments, her groundbreaking work on composite materials certification, her development of international safety standards, her mentorship of younger engineers, the audience listened with respectful attention. But perhaps her most significant contribution, Pierce continued, has been her leadership in establishing the standardized guidelines for regulatory application, or as they've come to be known throughout the industry, the Morgan Standards. A ripple of knowing smiles spread across the room. The nickname had stuck despite Gabrielle's modest protests. These standards have transformed how authority is exercised in commercial aviation, ensuring that regulations are applied consistently, transparently, and equitably. They represent not just a technical framework, but a moral commitment to dignity and fairness in air travel. Pierce gestured toward Gabrielle. It is my honor to present the Catherine Wright Medal to Dr. Gabrielle Morgan, whose integrity and expertise have made our skies not only safer, but more just. As Gabrielle rose to accept the award, the audience stood in unanimous applause. She took her place at the podium, the crystal medal catching the light as she set it beside her notes. "Thank you," she began once the applause subsided. "This recognition means a great deal to me, particularly because it acknowledges that technical excellence and ethical conduct are inseparable aspects of true aviation safety." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "My father was a Boeing engineer for 30 years. He gave me this watch when I graduated from MIT, and I've worn it every day since. He taught me that aviation is built on precision and integrity, that every calculation, every material, every decision must be guided by both technical accuracy and moral clarity." Her gaze swept across the room, making momentary eye contact with key industry leaders. "The standards that now bear my name, though I never sought that recognition, arose from a simple principle. Authority in aviation must be based on evidence and consistent application, rather than subjective judgment." Without directly referencing the Flight 847 incident, she addressed its broader implications. When regulations become tools of convenience rather than safety, when authority is exercised based on appearance rather than objective criteria, we undermine the very foundation of aviation safety, the belief that rules exist to protect everyone equally. Gabrielle spoke for several minutes about the implementation of the new standards, acknowledging the collaborative efforts of airlines unions and regulatory agencies. She highlighted Atlantic Global's leadership in adopting the guidelines and the measurable improvements in passenger experience that had resulted. In closing, she said, "I'd like to share something my mentor told me early in my career." She said, "Regulations aren't bureaucratic obstacles. They're written in blood. Every line exists because someone somewhere paid the ultimate price for its absence." This perspective has guided my work throughout my career. The understanding that standards are not arbitrary constraints, but essential protections that must be applied with both precision and compassion. As she returned to her seat amidst renewed applause, Gabrielle reflected on how her professional recognition had evolved. Once known primarily for her technical expertise in material certification, she was now equally respected for her leadership in addressing the human elements of aviation safety. The incident aboard Flight 847 had not defined her career, but it had expanded her influence in ways she hadn't anticipated. In the weeks following the award, Gabrielle received numerous invitations to speak at industry conferences, university, engineering programs, and corporate training events. While maintaining her primary focus on technical certification work, she accepted select opportunities to address broader issues of authority ethics and inclusion in aviation. At Massachusetts Institute of Technology, her alma mater, she delivered a guest lecture to engineering students that connected technical excellence with ethical responsibility. The materials we certify, the structures we approve, the regulations we establish. These aren't just technical achievements, she told them. They're moral commitments to the safety and dignity of every person who boards an aircraft. The lecture hall was filled beyond capacity with students sitting in aisles and standing along the back wall. Among them were significantly more women and people of color than would have been present when Gabrielle herself was a student. A gradual but meaningful change in the demographics of aerospace engineering. After the lecture, a young black woman approached her with a copy of Aviation Safety Quarterly, featuring Gabrielle's interview about regulatory application. Dr. Morgan. She said your work on the Morgan standards inspired me to focus on safety policy rather than just technical design. I'm hoping to join the FAA after graduation. These interactions became increasingly common as Gabrielle's influence expanded beyond traditional engineering circles. Young professionals, particularly women of color, sought her guidance on navigating careers in aviation and aerospace, fields where they often encountered the same biases and assumptions that she had faced throughout her career. In response, Gabrielle formalized a mentorship program within the FAA, creating structured opportunities for experienced professionals to guide emerging talent. The program emphasized not just technical development, but strategies for maintaining integrity and confidence in challenging environments. Professional publications increasingly featured her work with engineering excellence, naming her one of the 25 most influential women in Aerospace and Safety Leadership Journal, publishing an extended profile of her career and contributions. The articles focused primarily on her technical expertise, but acknowledged the impact of the Morgan standards on industry culture. Throughout this period of increased recognition, Gabrielle maintained her characteristic balance of confidence and humility. She accepted acknowledgement of her contributions while consistently emphasizing the collaborative nature of aviation safety and the many colleagues whose work had contributed to the standards that now bore her name. When Aviation International News requested an interview about becoming a symbol of passenger rights, she declined, suggesting instead a broader discussion of how technical and human factors intersect in aviation safety. The resulting article, titled "Beyond Materials: The Human Elements of Aviation Safety," became required reading in crew training programs across multiple airlines. A year after receiving the Catherine Wright Medal, Gabrielle was promoted to Associate Administrator for Aviation Safety at the FAA, one of the agency's highest technical positions. The appointment recognized not only her engineering expertise but her demonstrated ability to address complex challenges involving both technical standards and human behavior. In her new role, she gained broader authority to implement and enforce the Morgan standards across the industry, ensuring that what had begun as a personal stand for dignity aboard Flight 847 would continue to benefit travelers long after the specific incident had faded from public memory. 3 years after the Flight 847 incident, Gabrielle found herself once again at Dulles International Airport. She had just returned from a week-long conference in Singapore, where aviation authorities from across Asia had been implementing their own versions of the Morgan standards. The international adoption of these guidelines represented the fulfillment of her vision for consistent global application of aviation regulations. Tired from the long flight but satisfied with the progress made, she decided to stop at a large supermarket near the airport to pick up essentials before heading home. The normalcy of grocery shopping after days of high-level meetings was a welcome transition back to everyday life. As she pushed her cart through the produce section, selecting fruits and vegetables with the same careful attention she applied to all tasks, a familiar voice from the past caught her attention. "Price check on organic avocados," the voice called out over the store's intercom system. It was slightly flatter than Gabrielle remembered, lacking the authoritative edge it had carried aboard Flight 847, but unmistakably belonging to Rebecca Palmer. Gabrielle continued her shopping, moving methodically through her list. She had no desire to engineer an encounter with the former flight attendant, but fate had other plans. As she rounded the corner into the coffee aisle, she found herself face to face with Rebecca. The transformation in the woman was striking. Gone was the immaculate uniform and perfect coiffure that had been her armor aboard Atlantic Global flights. She now wore the standard red vest of a Marketplace Foods employee, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her face bearing lines of stress and exhaustion that hadn't been visible 3 years earlier. For a moment, they simply stared at one another, mutual recognition dawning simultaneously. Rebecca's face drained of color, her hands freezing in the act of arranging a promotional display of coffee beans. "Dr. Morgan," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hello?" Rebecca Gabrielle replied evenly. A heavy silence hung between them, the weight of their last encounter and all that had followed from it creating an almost tangible tension in the mundane setting of the grocery aisle. Rebecca glanced down at the scuffed linoleum floor, then back up, visibly struggling with what to say. The confidence that had once radiated from her was gone, replaced by a palpable uncertainty. "I know this is unexpected," Rebecca began haltingly, "and you certainly don't owe me your time. But since we've crossed paths, I need to say something." Gabrielle remained silent, neither encouraging nor discouraging the conversation. "I'm sorry," Rebecca said, the words emerging with evident difficulty. "What I did on that flight was wrong, not just unprofessional, wrong. I misused my authority. I tried to intimidate you. I made assumptions based on how you looked." She paused, gathering herself. "It took losing everything for me to see it clearly. My job wasn't just a paycheck. It was my identity. Being a senior flight attendant gave me control respect status. When that was gone, I had to face who I really was without the uniform, without the authority." Around them, shoppers moved past with their carts, oblivious to the significant moment unfolding amidst the coffee displays. "The worst part," Rebecca continued, her voice steadying, "is that I believed I was justified. I convinced myself that prioritizing certain passengers over others was just good customer service. I didn't see the bias in my decisions because I didn't want to see it." Gabrielle studied Rebecca's face, seeing genuine regret rather than self-pity. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked quietly. "Not for forgiveness," Rebecca replied quickly. "I don't expect that, and I'm not asking for it. I'm telling you because you deserve to hear it. That I know what I did was wrong, and that facing the consequences has changed me." There was dignity in her admission, a hard-earned honesty that contrasted sharply with the artificial authority she had projected during their first encounter. "Thank you for saying that," Gabrielle said after a moment. "It can't have been easy." Rebecca gave a small, rueful smile. "Easier than continuing to blame everyone else for my choices. That's what I did at first. Blamed you, blamed the airline, blamed the Whitmores for being difficult. It took months of therapy to recognize my own responsibility." She gestured vaguely toward the store around them. "This job is actually good for me. No authority to misuse, no status to hide behind. Just straightforward work where I'm judged on what I actually do, not who I think I am." Gabrielle nodded, understanding the profound shift this represented. "Sometimes we need to lose the external markers of identity to discover who we truly are." "The Morgan Standards," Rebecca said unexpectedly. "I've read about them. They're what we should have had all along. Clear boundaries, objective criteria, consistent application. If those had been in place 3 years ago, then other flight attendants wouldn't have to learn these lessons the hard way." Gabrielle completed the thought. They stood in silence for a moment, two women whose brief but consequential interaction had catalyzed industry-wide transformation. "I should let you finish your shopping," Rebecca said finally. "Thank you for listening. I've wanted to say these things for a long time, but never expected the opportunity." Gabrielle nodded. "I wish you well, Rebecca." As she turned to continue down the aisle, Rebecca spoke once more. "Your work on those standards, it's going to prevent what happened to me from happening to others. That's something good that came from all of this." With a final nod of acknowledgement, Gabrielle moved on, completing her shopping and proceeding to check out. As she loaded bags into her car, she noticed a plane taking off from nearby Dulles, its lights blinking against the evening sky as it climbed steadily toward cruising altitude. The encounter with Rebecca had provided an unexpected sense of closure, not because Gabrielle had needed an apology, but because it confirmed that the changes stemming from the Flight 847 incident extended beyond policies and procedures to touch individual lives and perspectives. Driving home through the gathering dusk, Gabrielle reflected on the journey that had brought her from seat 5D to her current position of influence in aviation safety. The confrontation aboard Flight 847 had never defined her. Her identity and authority had been firmly established long before Rebecca Palmer demanded she move, but it had expanded her impact in ways she couldn't have anticipated. As the lights of Washington appeared on the horizon, Gabrielle felt a sense of peace. The Morgan standards would continue to evolve and improve, but their foundation was solid. The principle that true authority in aviation, as in life, came not from uniforms or titles, but from integrity, expertise, and an unwavering commitment to treating every person with dignity and respect. The Morgan standards transformed air travel in ways that extended far beyond their technical specifications. 3 years after their implementation, passenger complaints about discriminatory treatment had declined by nearly 60% across all major carriers. Flight attendants reported greater job satisfaction and clearer guidelines for resolving conflicts. The industry had embraced not just the letter of the standards, but their underlying philosophy, that authority must be exercised with both consistency and compassion. Sofia Rodriguez, who had risen to become Atlantic Global's Director of Crew Training and Development, often began her sessions with new flight attendants by sharing the story of Flight 847, not as a cautionary tale about career-ending mistakes, but as a lesson in the proper understanding of authority and service. "Your uniform doesn't give you power over passengers," she would tell them. "It gives you responsibility toward them. Remember that distinction, and you'll never confuse the two." In her office at FAA headquarters, Dr. Gabrielle Morgan continued her work on next-generation aviation safety standards, mentoring a diverse group of young engineers who would carry forward her commitment to both technical excellence and ethical leadership. She never spoke publicly about the personal confrontation that had catalyzed the Morgan standards, preferring to focus on their ongoing implementation and improvement rather than their origin. Yet among those who understood the full story, her quiet stand for dignity aboard Flight 847 remained a powerful example of how one person's refusal to accept injustice could create ripples of positive change throughout an entire industry. True authority, she often reminded her mentees, isn't about making others feel small to make yourself feel important. It's about creating systems where everyone can occupy their rightful space with dignity and respect. It was a principle she had defended in Seat 5D, and one that now guided thousands of daily interactions in the complex human ecosystem of commercial aviation. If you've ever felt disrespected or discriminated against while traveling, this story is for you. Dr. Gabrielle Morgan's courage didn't just win her personal battle, it changed an entire industry. Remember, your right to dignity is never negotiable, no matter who challenges it. Please like this video if you believe everyone deserves respect in travel and beyond. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of justice and accountability in action. And share this with someone who might need the courage to stand their ground when faced with unfair treatment. Your voice matters, and sometimes standing firm can create change far beyond what you imagine.